So if I could just mention just for a minute before Brian gets started, then I'm going to put my mic on and probably not say anything. This is being brought to you by the Southern Management Association in association with CARMA. We have an affiliate relationship with CARMA, which means that SMA members get access to some of CARMA resources. And today, Brian Connelly and some members of his team at JOM will talk to us about some methodological issues. And I'm going to stop now. So thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Lisa. Just prior to the recording, we were chit-chatting about how useful this relationship is between SMA and CARMA. It's just a wonderful benefit for SMA members to be able to access the archive at CARMA. And I talked about how when I applied for this role, I'm currently the editor at the Journal of Management. And in order to get ready for that application, I tapped into the archive of CARMA instructions and short courses and just worked through them. And it was a great way to refresh my skills and learn what's on the cutting edge of methods right now. So I would really encourage folks to do that. It was really educational for me, and it prepared me to help be able to interview for this job. So I have three of my associate editors with me here. Thank you for joining me. Rebecca Greenbaum is on the micro side, and Aaron Hill is one of our strategy AEs, and Jim Combs, of course, is an entrepreneurship AE, and they'll be talking to you in just a moment. Before they do, I think what we'd like to do today is open up. The topic is methodological pitfalls, just talking with the JOM editors about some of the common issues that we're seeing in our editorial role at the Journal of Management. And each of us have a few thoughts we'd like to share before we open it up to a variety of questions. I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully I do this right. So I think I'm sharing screen now, but not quite as good as before, but this helps me look straight at my screen. What are some problems that we see with desk rejections? What do I look for first? I've heard a lot of people answer this question in different ways, that some editors will turn to the hypotheses first to see, if the hypotheses make sense. I've heard an editor say that they turn to the references to see if the paper fits within the conversation that's happening in their journal. I've heard an editor say that they turn to the discussion. Former JOM editor looks at the discussion to see what are the, is this an important problem, and have they summarized it? And one of the things that I'm finding that I look at very early on is the age of the data, because I'm just seeing too many articles that are kind of, it's almost like they're trying to brush it off, and keep this paper going forever. And they'll submit papers with old data and not explain why. So, if your data end in, maybe it's a strategy paper and your data end in 2013, it's 2021. You probably want to talk about why you didn't collect more recent data. And, a good reason is if it was very complex to collect that data, that's understandable. But if you're downloading things from an archival database and you happen to stop in 2013, there's very little reason why you couldn't have updated that first. I just rejected a paper this morning that looked at technology alliances, and the data ended in 2008. Well, how can we look at technology alliances when the technology has changed so much that alliances have likely changed as well, and the nature of alliances has changed over the past decade and a half. Data that don't address an organizational action, they're just not management papers, right? And so one problem here could be if the causality is distal, if the nature of what you're theorizing and what you're measuring is just too far away. Another is if there's nothing that anyone is doing in the paper, there's just no managerial action of any kind, then it's probably not, I mean, it is the Journal of Management, right? It's probably not a management paper if there's not any organizational action in there. And sometimes people will just put in the workplace, right? And they'll be looking at maybe some psychology constructs, or perhaps in the strategy paper, it's some sociology construct. But then in order to try and get it and frame it a little for the Journal of Management, they'll say in the workplace. Well, it's pretty clearly not a management paper just by inserting these words in various places. If you're looking, when you're talking about the execution of a paper, if you're looking at a single study of students, there's not a lot of papers that end up in the Journal of Management that are just a single study of students. So that would need a really strong rationale for why you're just looking at some students, and how that your ideas would certainly generalize. And if you're looking at MTurk and prolific, we need a measure of confidence that we can rely on your data. And we've actually got a neat little editorial commentary by Herman and Guinness that just came out about some of the steps you should probably go through if you're relying on these databases for your data. I get a number of papers that just have really simplistic analyses, and I'll share later that that's not necessarily a problem by itself, but if we can't look at the analyses and be confident that that we're actually seeing what we're seeing, then it could be desk rejected for that reason. And then sometimes we get papers that are just pure analysis, the hypotheses, and then boom, you start with the methods on page 3 or 4, and the journal that's not real consistent with what we're trying to accomplish at the Journal of Management. We love methods papers, but empirical papers that kind of skip the theory are less interesting, papers that are just all analysis. So so you get an initial decision that's not desk reject. Well, right now we're looking at a really high desk rejection rate. We're getting close to, we're still in the 50s. I put 60 here, but we're still in mid 50s or so, high 50s. And so what's happening here, I looked at it yesterday, or a few days ago. In the first year, we celebrated our 1-year anniversary as our editorial team on July 1st. And so I said, all right, how many submissions have we processed and looked at over the past year? Well, we've looked at, our editorial team has taken in 1,350 original submissions in the first year. And so I said, well, gee, is that normal? Let's look at the prior team in their first year. They took in 800. So there's been a huge increase of original submissions of the Journal of Management. And so, some of these methodological issues are really important toward getting past that initial hurdle, not getting a desk rejection based upon some basic methodological principles. We don't have a reject and resubmit option, by the way. So, and that's important because you think about the age of the data. For example, you submit a paper, where the age ends in 2008. You've taken your one shot, right? And you imagine all the more if the data ends in 2013. Now we might desk reject that, we might not. When you start getting into 2013, 2014, 2015, now you start asking questions about, all right, well, how interesting is this data? How interesting is the research question? Yeah, how much, do we think they can update this data? Will the phenomena generalize or still hold as they update the data? The sampling window they have compared to the sampling window they need. And so the question then becomes, without a reject and resubmit, do you want to waste your opportunity right here? I mean, you're going to get your paper rejected based upon the fact that you didn't update it. You really need to think about that on the initial decision. So you get past the initial decision. Well, let's talk about then, all right, what are some of the questions for the papers that aren't desk rejected? And here's some of the things I'm asking. Where are the descriptive statistics? Sometimes, we get papers submitted and we're not looking at a correlation matrix, and it's so important. I turn to the correlation matrix really quickly, and especially I want to see the DV. A lot of times a correlation matrix will not have a dependent variable in it, and that kills me, because I need to be able to take a look at, all right, what are these beta coefficients and how do they relate to the hypotheses that we've got? And when you have a correlation matrix, really important to include the scales on there as well, because I want to be looking at means and standard deviations, and I want to get a feel. This correlation matrix and the means and standard deviations, and understanding them. Like, a lot of times people will normalize variables in their models, and then they'll report the mean and standard deviation for their normalized variables. Well, we pretty much know what those are, right? So what we want to see in the descriptive statistics is your actual means and standard deviations, so that we can start to get a feel for the variables that you're measuring and how they relate to one another, and the scale of these variables. That's going to tell us a lot. It's a really important table, and people sometimes either leave it out or do it wrong. So it's a really important place to start on the initial submission. Another thing here is not explaining how you measure a variable. Oftentimes we'll get so involved with the weeds of a paper that we forget to describe in transparent detail how we collected a particular variable, or what was our decision-making rubric when we were coding a variable. That'll often come back anytime that there's a coding process involved, and maybe multiple coders. Really important to describe the rubric that you use. And of course, some important questions here are, why did you select these particular variables? And I think, sometimes we're familiar with the question, why these moderators and not others? We get that question a lot, right? And that's kind of a conceptual question, but more of an empirical question is, why these control variables and not others? I think what's helpful here is a couple of things. One is to cluster your control variables, not empirically, but conceptually cluster them and describe, okay, this set of control variables is dealing with, pardon me, with this particular alternative explanation. How do they work together? And that's an important consideration as well, is when you get your battery of control variables, are they nullifying each other, or are they changing the nature of your predictor in some way? And so, there's been some discussion lately of trying to include the right control variables, but not go overboard. There is a temptation to just have a long laundry list of control variables, and that's not necessarily better. And then the dependent variable as well. Here, I think it's important to say, why is it important? That's more of a conceptual issue, but empirically, it's important to measure your dependent variable differently. And a lot of papers don't do this, but a lot of papers do. And when they do, it carries a lot of weight. It really, if you can say, we've measured this dependent variable in two different ways that capture the same construct, that's going to carry a lot of weight for your paper. I like what Anthony Nyberg says about this. Pardon me. Is go to great lengths to try to prove that your paper is wrong, that your results are wrong. And he'll do it. He's great with this. He'll operationalize things different ways to try to say, this is wrong. So that by the time he gets some results and they're empirically robust, he can feel very confident in putting that forward. So so you get past the desk reject, you get past the initial submission, and you get a revision. Now this is good news for you. You get a revision at JOM, and now your chances of getting another revision and ultimately likely being accepted are, you're looking at 50-50. And some papers will be accepted after their first revision, but half of them are going to get another chance at this. So now what do you do? Now what's important methodologically in the review process? Well, here I think it's important to admit mistakes. It's not a sign of weakness to just say you were wrong about something. And even if you just got something really wrong, the reviewer identified something where this was not representing your contract, or you normalize this and that means something totally different than what you're saying. And just say, look, we got it wrong, but fix the problem. And reviewers are going to be super open to that. And it's going to, I think there's a temptation to feel like, oh, I'll look stupid, but that is not the case at all. If you can admit a mistake and fix it, it's a good look for you. If you just don't have the data, or if it's just, sometimes I've said, look, it's just going to be too much work to create this data. We couldn't do it. And just say so. Don't try to dance around that. And now here's something that's important too, is I think that you can disagree, but you really got to choose your battles. People will adopt different stances on this, and I'm sure you'll hear editors that say different things about how much you should disagree. Personally, I feel like you should respond as much as possible to what the reviewers are asking. And the reasons for that is really very high levels. I feel like science advances more when we can combine the best of what authors have with the best of what reviewers think about their work. And so that means the more responsive we are, I think in general, papers will be better off. So I think you should keep disagreeing to a minimum. Save it for where you think it's really important. But for the most part, think about what you can do to be responsive to reviewers, because they're probably thinking about your methods differently than you are. They might be they're bringing a whole different set of skills to the problem. And so they can offer things and perspectives that you may not account for. If you change your paper, explain why. Never change something in the review process in the method section without explaining it. I think that's really unfair to the reviewers. You don't want to just throw something in there and never mention it. That's, they might not notice it. And so if you're going to make a change, be clear about it. You can talk with the editors about methods issues, but you just really need to understand, when you're working on a paper, nobody understands your paper better than you. And so, editors got a lot going on. They've got families, they're taking vacations, they're handling all these papers, their kids get sick, and then all of a sudden, you send them an email that says, well, gee, should we use return on assets or return on sales? And they don't even know what you're talking about, right? And so, so just understand that, when for an editor to get to a decision letter, they've read through your whole paper. They've read through all the reviews. They've probably gone back and overlaid those on top of each other before they wrote your decision letter. They're so enmeshed in your work when they wrote that decision letter. But then 2 months later, when you email them, they've done that again for several other papers. And so it's very hard for them to just jump right back into your paper. So you can't really you can't kind of hide behind editors that way. They can be helpful. They can provide expertise if you need it, but they, you know, you can't say, well, gee, the editor said to do this, and therefore we're doing it. That's a, you know, that's a tall order for an editor. So I would just be cautious about doing that. I think the review process also is a great time to add a method-specific co-author if it warrants it. I've done this several times where you know, the reviewers wanted a particular method, and I'll bring someone on that's an expert in that method. If the reviewers ask for something in the review process that's new methodologically, I might bring on a methods co-author. They're usually last author at that point, but they can help with those issues. And then if you get a second revision, you're in really good stead. Very likely that your paper will make it through if you can get through some of those hurdles that you just described. That was a little longer than I wanted to go, but those are some opening thoughts on my end. I'm going to turn things over to Rebecca, and then Jim, and then Aaron. Rebecca, let me. I'm going to put myself on mute, and would love to hear your opening comments on the topic.
Hi, everyone. You can hear me okay? You can shake your head. Okay, good. Thank you. Okay, I'm basically going to go over some of the OB or micro-oriented methodological issues that commonly come up. I won't, of course, capture everything just because we don't have time for that, but I'll go over those that I consider to be a little bit more prevalent. So the first that I wanted to cover has to do with, and this is just what my overview is going to go over. So the high points that I want to illustrate to you, it's related to micro OB, which makes sense since I'm a micro editor. The first has to do with construct validity. And what I mean here, it's not just measure validation. So of course it is important to use measures that have been validated. So right now I'm mostly talking about field data, because survey-based data, because that's most of the research that comes across my desk. At JOM, I am seeing more experimental data, which I like to see, because I always think it's great when authors are able to pair their field survey data along with an experiment. And I'll talk more about that as I continue. But when you consider measures, yes, if you can have a validated measure that's already been validated by other researchers or in a different publication, that's a great situation. I won't get into scale development today, but some of those papers can work well at JOM too. But it's more than just measure validation. It's also whether or not the specific variable that you're using actually matches your theory. And so some of what I'm going to advise on today has to do with theory and empirics. So the two combined, because I think it's a really important point. So for example, and I'll try to provide examples when I can, and my examples are going to be more extreme than what I often see when things come across, just because I want to illustrate the point. Let's say that you're trying to propose that abuse of supervision is going to lead to an employee's workplace deviance, and you suggest that it's going to occur through social exchange theory, and your hypotheses center on social exchange theory. But then when I get to the method section, your social exchange mechanism is shame. Shame doesn't match that theory at all. And so this is where this happens quite often. It's usually more subtle than that. But this is where I would probably come back and say something like, well, shouldn't it be something like perceived supervisor support, where if someone abuses you, you have less supervisor support. And that specific construct is couched within social exchange theory. So there's a fit there and it makes a bit more sense. So that's one thing that I see quite a bit. Sometimes it's an issue too, where the label of the variable sounds like it's going to fit the theory, but then when you actually look at the items, it has poor face validity, and it doesn't seem like it quite matches what you're talking about theoretically. So that's a common issue that I tend to see as well. Another thing that has to do with construct validity is I see this more and more often, where scholars will use shortened measures, but they won't really explain why they're using shortened measures. I do see that sometimes scholars will use shortened measures and it's seen as being more legit without a full-blown validation. But if you don't really provide an explanation as to why it's a shortened measure, it comes across as perhaps just cherry picking 3 items that maybe look better for your results and saying that you needed to use a shortened measure for whatever reason. I'm not saying that that always happens, but sometimes it gives the appearance of that. And so justifying or explaining your use of shortened measures or why you might need to alter measures to fit your specific research context is always an important thing. So that's just one issue. and I am tracking my time here. So the second thing that I wanted to talk about, because I am getting more experimental studies come my way, sometimes I'll receive an experiment where the manipulation does not seem to match the construct definition, or there's too much noise. So again, I'll try to provide an example here. Let's say you were trying to manipulate leader hypocrisy. And so you're going to do this by having maybe a control or a neutral condition, or maybe even a low hypocrisy condition, and then compare that to a condition where it's high leader hypocrisy. And let's say you're just doing this through a description of some sort. In your high description, if along with leader hypocrisy, you're making a lot of statements that imply low fairness or low organizational justice, you're basically creating a confound, because we don't really know if it's hypocrisy, where values and deeds don't align with one. I'm not going to get into the definition of hypocrisy, but it's usually when you say that something exists and then you don't actually follow through in your actions. So, oh, I care about justice, but I'm not actually going to be a just leader, that type of thing. So, but my point here is that if you create too much noise by combining constructs and then you can't clearly figure out what the construct is that you're manipulating for that reason, or it aligns too much with a different construct, that can be an issue too, where things just get a little bit messy and it's not quite clear that you're capturing what you intended to capture. Okay, so moving on to a third, sample size. If sample sizes are too small, that can be problematic. And oftentimes this depends on how complex your model is, how many variables you're examining at once, how many indicators if you're using structural equation modeling or something like that. I'm seeing this more and more often where authors will provide a power analysis to justify their specific sample size. That's a good rule of thumb to show that, hey, look, my sample size should be sufficient. I feel like usually 250 is around the number for field studies that I see, and it tends to be usually pretty good in terms of capturing the intended effects. But again, it just depends on how complex your model is, how many controls you have, how many total variables, that type of thing. With experiments, when I started as a doc student, my advisor was like, oh, 10 to 15 participants per cell. That's really no longer the case. It seems like more research has shown that the results of experiments are too unstable if it's that low. So it's more like 50 per cell nowadays is what I'm finding. So if you have a 2x2, then if 50 per cell would be an N of around 200. And so that would be a rule of thumb that you could potentially use. Another thing that comes up on occasion is if you have really low effect sizes and you have this extremely large sample size, it does call into question whether or not you're just finding effects because your sample size is so large. So even though we usually say bigger sample sizes are better, I think that particular combination does call into question the practical utility of your research if you have like a 2,000 sample size, which we don't find that often. I will say we just don't find it that often in organizational behavior, but if you did, or if you had an experiment where you had like 500 per cell, you might start to wonder, okay, are they just finding effects because with that large of a sample size, you're going to find any effect? So that's something that comes up on occasion as well. A fourth common methodological issue that I tend to come across fairly often is related to incremental validity, or the fact that authors don't always rule out alternative effects. So to provide an example that hopefully will be understandable to you, when I was a doc student, ethical leadership was the new construct on the block, and I did some research in that area. Scholars who early on were doing research on ethical leadership, though, they had to show that this wasn't just transformational leadership. And so this would be something that back then, this isn't really the case anymore because there's been a lot of research on ethical leadership. But let's say back then I would have received a paper where someone said ethical leadership is positively related to trust. A reviewer could then come in and say, well, did you account for transformational leadership? Did you include that as a control to ensure that ethical leadership is telling us something different in terms of the relationship between leadership and trust? So I think that's one that's quite important. I like control variables if they make theoretical sense. And I think they can be really good in terms of showing that your specific construct is telling us something new within a literature, especially if it's a newer construct and a newer variable. There's other common OB problems that I'm sure most of you have heard, common method variance. So you wouldn't necessarily, and Brian spoke to this to some extent, but when everything is same source, so only employees are rating everything on the survey, it's all at the same point in time. That's very simple data. And so that can be a problem. Your better bet is if you can have multi-wave data where your independent variable or antecedents measured at time 1, and maybe a couple weeks later you capture your mediator. And then the best case scenario would be then if your dependent variable is measured by a different source. So multi-wave, multi-source data tends to work really well. Of course, longitudinal data is really great too, which gets to my next point, which has to do with reverse causality. If you can have longitudinal data, I feel like I don't see it very often, or not true longitudinal data, or at least not in on the organizational behavior side, but that is like the gold standard. What I tend to think is a good compromise is if you do have a nice multi-source, multi-wave field study, if you combine that with an experiment, that's another way to improve your internal validity. And this is why I personally really like when you have, I feel like JOM doesn't see it as much as other journals actually, but if you do have that field study and pair it with an experiment, that can be a nice way to show external and internal validity if it's done well. That can be a great research package. There's also other things that I see authors do that help with causality issues is, reverse causal tests. Those types of things can sometimes be worked into the manuscript to say like, hey, look, we tried our best with our data. We weren't able to secure longitudinal data, but we did these reverse causal tests, used XYZ statistics, and it shows that the proposed order of variables goes along with our theory. So that's one thing that you could look at doing as well. Okay, so then moving on, Brian already spoke to this to some extent, but only convenient samples. I think it can be okay sometimes to use an MSRC sample if it's the right research question, but that alone I don't think would be advisable. I would advise to, if you're going to use a convenient sample, maybe as an initial test of your theoretical model, pairing that with organizational data, or at a minimum, an experimental data combined with one of these more convenient samples. Same with student populations. Student samples, I should say, if you combine that with an adult or those who have more work experience, I suppose, or students are adults. But if you combine the two, I think that could be a good thing too. So I wouldn't go with just students. I wouldn't go with just a convenient sample. I would pair those with other studies. You do see in micro research, it's much more often that you see multi-studies as well. So I see, sometimes I'll see tautologies or studies that lend themselves to too much percept biases. What I mean by that is, let's say that you're saying something like, just to go back to my example of ethical leadership, you say ethical leadership is going to increase organizational justice, but then if you actually look at the items associated with ethical leadership, it includes justice. So then it's a situation where it's like, are you just predicting yourself? In which case you can't really disprove what you're saying with your specific data. So that's something, or it's something where you read, I'll be reading a manuscript and this is where it's just a judgment thing. I'll look at the specific items associated with a measure, and then I'll look at the mediators items, and they just seem so similar that you just question, or I tend to question, whether or not they're really capturing anything different between the two constructs. And theory should drive what's being chosen for those constructs too. So maybe to some extent, this goes along with what I talked about in terms of just the validity of measures overall. I feel like these are some issues that I see fairly often. Okay, I think I did pretty well on time in spite of the fact that I didn't pull up my slides, but that's all I have for you right now.
Thank you, Rebecca. Super interesting. Very, very good points. And I love your examples. You talk about leader hypocrisy. And, that's so fun. I mean, that's even fun around the living room table. I'm used to saying, oh, what are the institutional effects of resource dependence? It's really hard to make friends at cocktail parties with that. But leader hypocrisy, that goes a long way. That's fun. You can talk about that. No, I loved it. Thank you very much. So we're going to turn to Jim now. Jim, of course, has been editor and associate editor at a wide range of journals, and has joined us here at JOM to really ramp up our entrepreneurship presence. And so, Jim, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Let's see if I have a little better luck with the sharing here. I feel like that worked. Okay, I'm getting nods, so that's a good thing. So yeah, Brian asked me to come here and sort of talk about methodological challenges in entrepreneurship. And while I'm grateful to have been invited and participate, I sort of feel like I'm going to be redundant with Rebecca and Aaron, and the reason is because a lot of the work that I see in entrepreneurship, because we cross levels, we look at emotions, we look at things like grief, we look at personality traits and how they affect certain outcomes, and so that's very OB-ish. And we also look at alliances and survival and firm performance and organizational structure. And then we have sort of our own domain, I would say, in terms of things like opportunity recognition and that sort of thing. So talk about old data, what Brian was complaining about, but this comes from a Short et al. Piece where they sort of looked at sort of top tier journals with entrepreneurship research. About 35% of the papers have some sort of survey data or use some sort of surveys. They found that 4% use experiments, but if you look at the entrepreneurship journals, it's probably more like 12 to 18% that are using experiments. It's actually a pretty I would say it's one of the things that we do in entrepreneurship that is somewhat, it's certainly not unique to us. It comes out of psychology, but it's something that is really quite, there's some things that's the only way we can get at it. It's probably the best way to say it. About 66% of our stuff has some archival elements into it, sort of secondary data. And I think this is low, honestly. They said 2% are interviews, qualitative. I would guess it's probably closer to 5%, but it is sort of a minority of studies that are using sort of qualitative. So I thought I'd just kind of go through each of these and give you some of my quick thoughts on what's wrong with them or some of the problems that I see. But I want to say one thing, and we touched on this a little bit, but other than the mismatch between theory and the method, which is a methodological problem in a way, it's both a methodological problem and a theoretical problem. And Rebecca alluded to this in her field as well. Most of the papers that, by the time they get to me, now when Brian sees them, he's probably rejecting them on method, right? For desk rejects. But by the time they get to me, it's rare that I reject on methods. And so while I think this is really important that we're doing this and that we talk about this and that we hone our methodological skills, at the end of the day, like this paper by Stevenson and I think that's pronounced Josephy, they looked at, they took a bunch of papers that had experiments in them that were not yet submitted and followed them through and asked the authors about their experience with the submission and where the papers ended up. And almost 90%, one of the reasons that they got rejected was a lack of theoretical contribution. So it tends not to be a driving factor. It's an important factor and it has to be there, it has to be right. And without it, you will get rejected. But it, at the end of the day, tends not to be the driving factor in my experience. So in the OB stuff, again, we deal with a lot of OB things, but we don't reach OB standards, is how I would sort of say it. We tend to have smaller N size. Rebecca said 250. I thought, oh boy, that'd be nice. get 250. We tend to have a lot of studies where we have the IVs and the DVs collected at the same time. Convenient samples where they're, out of an incubator or out of the schools, they're connected with a school or the university in some way. And this one I think is a big one is failure to use not use validated scales, or if you develop your own scale, which is common because we're often dealing with things that, like in Rebecca's examples, all of those were sort of established constructs. Often we're dealing with not yet established constructs. So we do need new measures for them, but a lot of times they'll just grab some items and run them out and say, well, we got reliability, we're good. And instead of running through all of the steps that needed to be done to make sure, first you run it on a survey with the students and then you check convergent validity and, on multiple samples. There's processes for that are pretty well established and they need to be followed. So a lot of it is because, unlike an OB where you might go to one or two organizations and get the organization to sponsor you so that you have a large number of employees, we're looking at entrepreneurs who really are across a lot of different organizations. So it really is more challenging, but in some ways that's not a cop-out, and that's part of the problem. In the experimental side, probably the biggest thing I see is ecological validity, which has to do with the relationship between the experimental design the description, the vignettes, the context, and the phenomena that you're actually trying to study in the real world. And that the gap between those gets too wide for reviewers to buy. That you're really tapping into the sort of fundamental thing. And then, you know, as Rebecca said, student samples are a problem. I'm sort of the bias where I like to see, when I get an experimental design, I like to see, you know, often, you know, the first experiment might be with students and it creates one problem. And then, so you then go to MTurk and you're able to solve that problem with another design. And then you go on to studying entrepreneurs. That may have a different problem in it, but when you put the three together, you can kind of put the evidence and really nail down the problem. But it may take 2 or 3 studies to kind of get there. Failure to control for key alternatives. You know, with these experiments, if you don't think through, and I'm actually glad Rebecca's, like I said, I'd be redundant with these folks. Just, you know, if your manipulation check or your manipulation or the thing you're manipulating is correlated to other variables that might provide an alternative explanation, that's going to get you in trouble. And then in terms of internal validity, measuring moderators and mediators in the same instrument, so that now the main advantage of an experiment is you get to make statements about causality. But if you measure things sort of simultaneously, then you can lose some of those benefits. Or if the manipulation check doesn't work, there's a temptation just to focus on those where the manipulation was successful. But then now you've got an endogeneity problem because there's a relationship between whether or not the manipulation check worked and your outcome, quite likely. So that's another problem there. The other place where, you know, we see a lot of archival data. The biggest problem here, and I actually kind of laughed when Rebecca said this because I thought this was the thing that OB people didn't have to deal with, but oh boy, they do. Is that, you know, the data were collected for other purposes, and you know, we have these big data sets where, you know, universities get together and they collaborate and they have these really sophisticated designs and data collections. The Global Entrepreneurship Monitoring is one. The PSED is older now. I remember the PSED came out. I think I was still with AMJ back then, and I rejected so many papers that came through because they'd say, you know, we've got this great theory and here's our story, and then, well, we can't measure any of that, but we can measure this, right? And I'm like, well, wait a minute, that, you know, you can't. That's a bait and switch, and you just sort of can't do that. And that sort of relates to construct validity. That what's in the secondary databases often doesn't match with the story you want to tell. And so you either have to find a story that matches the data, but that's really all you can do because the data is fixed, right? There's not a lot of ways around that. Or the other thing you can do is actually combine with a secondary method. But I'll give you an example, actually. I had a study where we were looking at boards of directors and we were trying to get at this this cognitive bias, and we were able to show that the effects of the cognitive bias occurred, but we couldn't actually prove that that this was what was actually going on. So we combined it with an experiment where we really could show that the mechanism was occurring among directors, and the two sort of solve that problem. Endogeneity, I just sort of see Aaron. He's going to speak next. I'm sure he's going to talk about this. But I want to point out that we in entrepreneurship have a specific kind of endogeneity problem that is somewhat unique in the sense that we don't get to include in our sample the people who didn't start a business. So that we have a random sample of those who did and who didn't. And we can't include those who were successful and those who failed. Because often when we look at new ventures, we really have a sample of those who either did get financing or did survive. And there are some statistical tools and other things that I think Aaron will probably talk about. But that's a real problem and something that we just sort of perennially have to deal with. Can't get at the causal mechanisms behind things. And again, this is a place where I think the experiments supplemented with archival data can be really kind of a helpful tool for doing that. You know, we say something like, the relationship between A and B, or you know, between this set of resources and this action that the alliances that they're getting these alliances because they want more legitimacy, but we're not measuring legitimacy, right? And there's nothing in the database that'll let us get at that theoretical mechanism. So sometimes we can get through that. Rebecca also mentioned this one, but we do get samples of 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000. 20, 500 firms over 20 years, and then we get a statistically significantly non-zero relationship of 0.004, right? And it's just like I'm not going to change my business because I can significantly change things by 0.004, right? It's statistically non-zero, but it's not really non-zero. It's not meaningful. So you really have to describe effect sizes in very practical terms that show that this matters. It's something that a manager wants to pay attention to. I don't want to say too much about qualitative, partially because I'm not very skilled in that area. I don't see too many of them outside the family business area. The ones I see, and the main problem with them is just they're unsophisticated relative to what I see in sort of organizational theory and some other areas. They tend to ask questions that could be addressed in other ways, more simple ways, and they don't go through the full analysis and the full data processes that we would expect. And so one thing I should probably say is when I get a paper, because of the different methods we deal with, I often will send it to one person who's a content expert and one person, like if I get a qualitative paper, I may not have a qualitative entrepreneurship person to send it to. So I'll send it to a qualitative OB or a qualitative macro person, and then somebody who's a content area. So you are going to have to meet the standards that are within those sort of other fields. Sort of to wrap up, I don't know how I did on time here, but to sort of wrap up, this is a quote that was in that paper by Jeremy that I thought out. It's, quite frankly, entrepreneurship research is 10 years behind strategy, which until recently was 10 years behind OBHR. The good news is the learning curve is a lot quicker now. So I don't think strategy is really behind as much as just different now, I think I would say. And I'm not sure I wouldn't say we're 10 years behind, but we're still probably 3 to 5 years behind in terms of solving some of the problems. So the broad thing I would sort of leave you with is as you're doing entrepreneurship research, look at what the OB people, what their standard is, because that's where we're going. And when you want to look at what you're using archival data, look at the strategy people, because that's where we're going. We're a little behind, but we're getting there. Right? All right, I think I'm done. I'll see if I can get this back to you.
Holy cow, so cool. Yeah, really some great comments that, the one thing you mentioned, most papers are not rejected for methods. Totally agree with that. And wow, that's a nuclear bomb. You said that and I thought, holy cow, I've never heard anyone say that before. And it is entirely true. I'm kind of mentally going through all the decision letters I've written, and I can't think of a single instance when methods was the #1 issue. Usually, you kind of get down to the third or fourth point, and you mention a few methods problems, but that wasn't really why you were rejecting the paper. And so that was really profound. If you want to know where we're headed, look at what OB is doing. Also, really true. And I think I've experienced that, as a strategy researcher. I've just looked at what they're doing, the standards they're holding themselves to, and said, we need to be doing a number of things there as well.
In strategy, we actually got held to the economist standard.
Also true, right? Yeah, that's also true. Yeah, more and more it seems. Yeah, that's real. All right, very good point. All right, thank you, Jim. We're gonna turn it over to Aaron now. So Jim talked from the entrepreneurship side. Aaron's sharing the screen, and he's going to talk to us about some strategy, the strategy side of methods. Aaron, it's all yours.
So you should see this now. Anyway, I'm Aaron Hill, Associate Editor. Some of my stuff may be redundant, so I'll try and go quickly to leave room for Q&A. If you have questions, please feel free to email, etc. Opening caveat, since this is a methods talk, I tried to approach this from a methodology standpoint. I am not a text analysis guru by any means, but what I did was cut out text from a number of articles, which I'm happy to share with you, and tried to pare them down as I would a method. So they're not perfectly like amenable to an exploratory factor analysis, but anyway, there's various sources, and I tried to kind of pare them down. 2 factors largely emerged, somewhat qualitative, somewhat quantitative here, but I'll go through those 2 factors, which I labeled as core issues. The first one is that there seem to be a number of indications that it's just not the best possible submission. And the reason that's a problem is it leads the reviewers to think that, okay, you maybe could fix this, but the current state of the quality is so low that I don't think you could fix it. Like you don't have enough knowledge, or you're not diligent enough, or it would require an entire new set of analyses, which then is a new paper. So, you know, not your best possible solution. There's lots of causes for this that were cited, so it's easy to get tired as an author. These are my own errors too. Certainly I've done that. It's easy to lack clarity. Brian mentioned this. We know what we did really well, but a reader may not. So we kind of gloss over it on a way that leads the reviewer to think it's incomplete or wrong. It's easy to gloss over and be less thorough, like on an analysis or on the way a variable's measured, or even to simply forget, you know, the correlation matrix. So one guide for this best possible solutions, there's a series of editorials that were offered, and one is on methods by Zhang and Shah. And they suggest using the 3 C's. And I've often tried to go through a methods paper and see if I'm meeting this. And it's kind of hard because, like I said, we know what we're doing, or we know what we've done, but making sure that it's complete, clear, and credible. And what does that look like? That looks like explaining what and why for each decision. So some of the issues we've talked about, poor sampling or measurement, as Brian said, it's okay if you have an issue. Like, hey, this data is hard to get, so we do have a convenience sample. That's fine, but you need to be clear on that and explain why, so that people can assume or can assess if you're credible. Same with analyses. Justify what and why with theory and tests. So when Jim was talking about selection, I'll see a lot of papers that say, hey, we corrected for selection. Well, they didn't tell us what the selection problem was. They didn't tell us why. They didn't tell us what the variables were that factored into this. It's just like, believe me, I corrected it. I just don't think people are there to believe you. Our job as reviewers is fundamentally to ask those questions. So you're giving someone whose task is to ask questions ammunition to ask. So rather just tell them, hey, this is what we did and why. Brian also mentioned this, but conduct and report additional tests. I love participating in these things because I learn a ton. So Brian, I wrote down what you said. I'm going to take a more proactive approach in trying to disprove my own findings. I think oftentimes we maybe try and hide behind it, or things aren't robust. If that's the case, we don't really want to publish it anyway. So, you know, conduct and report those tests, even in footnotes or in, I mean, anymore, almost every journal has the ability to archive things online. So, you know, put them as a footnote that they're available online, or submit them and let the editor know you went over the page length, but, you know, the last 20 pages are robustness tests that can be moved online. And Jim and Rebecca both mentioned this. Interpret the empirical and practical significance. 0.004 may be really meaningful if it's like firm performance of billion-dollar companies. Like, okay, that could be a meaningful practical effect. Other times it could be meaningless. So just be open and put that in there. Interpret the practical significance. So the three C's, I think, should help issues in rejection, not necessarily from the AE's standpoint, like, hey, I'm going to desk reject because this is unclear, but rather from the entire review team, that reviewers, if they don't know what's going on and they don't have a sense that they can trust you, they're probably less inclined to view every part of the manuscript favorably. They're less inclined to rate, you know, this is an important problem, etc. So it permeates the entire process. So some example problems. Again, a quirky sample, explain why. Time is a big one. We see a lot of dated samples, and that can be okay, but it is a red flag. So explain, you know, hey, in this industry, we have to use this period because of regulations that came out, and these regulations actually give us a really pure test. Okay, I can buy that. But if you just say I stopped in the year 2006, that's a long time ago. Unique analyses. Some of this may be out of people's fear that they don't know what's going on. But if people can't follow what you're doing intuitively, that's a red flag. We try and have methodologically competent reviewers, and oftentimes if it is a unique analysis, we get someone specifically expert in that analysis. But that said, if it's unique, you have to explain to the reader what's going on and why, so that the generally informed methodologist that maybe doesn't know your specific technique can follow along and have confidence. 3, Brian mentioned this, measure A versus measure B versus measure C, etc. I see this a lot on dependent variables like firm performance, and it's measured with return on sales. Like, that's fine. That's probably not the most common measure. So what about another measure? What about ROA, or what about Tobin's Q? Lots of measures have problems, but to the degree that the problem undermines the research, if you can sub it in and out, I think that's more clear, it's more complete, it's more credible. Robust to reasonable alternatives, particularly as Jim said, with our archival data, we're often forced to make assumptions or forced to make choices that in a perfect research design we wouldn't have to make. So, you know, is there a reasonable alternative? Like, firm size was measured by employees. Okay, that's not a good measure for a lot of firms because income and employees are not necessarily correlated. So can you use something else? Can you use assets? Well, assets may be correlated with return on assets, but if it's robust to all of these alternatives, that's a good evidence. And 5th, specifically, endogeneity. This is often cast both from an author standpoint and from a reviewer standpoint that you have endogeneity, or we addressed endogeneity. That's really not enough information. We need to know what the source is. So Jim mentioned one source being selection. So just be very clear that here's the selection problem, here's why it's a concern, here's what we did, rather than saying there's endogeneity and we used selection correction. Well, that selection correction may not be appropriate for another form of endogeneity. So really connecting the dots for the reviewer on that. And this, again, should help avoid the issues. Core issue number 2 is the mismatch. And Rebecca and Jim both spoke to this a little bit, as did Brian. There's a lot of areas where there can be misalignment, and there's no one way to solve it. But it could be in all areas of methods, and it could be across studies that you address it. So, you know, if one study has a real limitation, but you can address it with another, as Rebecca and Jim said, I think that's a good way to go about it. For example, a sample is quirky. Hey, we can't get a great sample of entrepreneurs, so we have this sample that's biased by selection, but we also use students. Or, hey, we couldn't get surveys of executives, so we proxied it, but we also did an experiment with MBA students. Some of those things, you know, can create better alignment across a series of studies rather than, you know, using a convenient sample of students to proxy executives. Certainly with measures, if they don't fit, as Rebecca said. Model specification, I see this one a lot in that the arguments will be of a continuous nature, like the firm will perform better. And then the measure will be, did they make more than the last year, like dichotomous, and it's, you know, it mismatches the theory. So as a caveat, again, you may need more than one sample, or more than one sample or set of analyses can help. Some examples, again, sample temporality. Jim mentioned this. There are times when cross-sectional data is the best we can do. If that's the case and your argument implies change over time, that's going to be a problem. So you may need to couple that with a sample where you can fundamentally address that. Sometimes the convenience sample, I mean, personally, I'm willing to buy it, but I'm someone who studies executives and will get students. And I just don't know if that's the bar in today's world, that we can expect undergrads to function at the level that a CEO would. At the same time, I'm someone who's done some sports research. And so I tend to see papers as a reviewer that are using sports data, but then they'll say they're executives. And like, a head coach is not necessarily the same as a CEO. In some contexts, maybe, but in other contexts not. So really making sure that the sample matches. Certainly measurement, again, the binary versus continuous, and model specification. Brian mentioned this, as did Rebecca. Control variables are excluded. Jim talked about it being a multi-level question that's analyzed not as such. So when the model specification doesn't match, the test just isn't very strong. So there are times in which we can't maybe do the optimal design. Hey, I couldn't get data on this control, so we proxied it with a bad control. It's the best we can do. Okay, I'm willing to buy that. There's an increasing number of tools out there. So Joan Busenbark just published a paper in Journal of Management about impact thresholds of confounding variables, which can be really helpful for, hey, we couldn't get data on this control variable, but even if we could, how correlated would it have to be? And so you can make some reasonable claims that, well, the control variable would have to be correlated more strongly than it is in other papers in the field. It just accumulates evidence, going back to the 3 C's. It gives you credibility that your estimation is accurate even without a control variable. There's further reading here that I'm happy to share with you in terms of papers that I pulled together for the content analysis. But that's my 2 big points: is be as clear and complete as you can. Seems like we often spend a lot of time on the intro and the theory, and then the methods are like kind of a checklist of, well, I know I have to discuss the sample. So we get a little bit of detail about the sample, but not a lot of descriptives, not a lot of clarity in terms of, does this sample fit? So really slowing down on the methods and being thorough, and then avoiding some of these low-hanging mismatch problems, I think can be quite helpful. One of which for strategy people is endogeneity. Like saying that you corrected for endogeneity with a 2-stage approach may not address the specific issue of a sample selection bias unless you use a particular derivation of that. So we get a misfit.
Perfect. Thank you, Aaron. That was outstanding. You so many good points there. A couple of things I think are really important that you mentioned, especially important, I should say, is one's particular to JOM, and that's the notion of extra analyses. We love that. We're big fans at JOM of supplementary analyses. And as Aaron mentioned, you can put them online. And that's super. I mean, it's super easy to access. If you look at JOM articles, you're going to find online appendices are very common, and it provides a permanent record of some of the supplementary analyses, which can be really extensive. And so I've done that a lot in my own work, and we really enjoy when authors do that. Another thing that really struck home with me that you mentioned, Aaron, is the compilation of your choice of measures, so that how they work together. This is not something I hear a lot about, but I'm seeing it a lot, both in papers that I'm reading and in doctoral students that I'm working with, where you'll get 2 measures on the strategy side. You get 2 measures that make perfect sense. We're looking at firm size, which we measured with sales, and firm performance, which we measured with return on sales. But then, it's kind of hidden, firm size is this control variable we always control for. But performance is one of your major DVs. Well, your results could look very different when you take sales as a control variable out of your return on sales model. And so I think that was a great point. I'm glad you highlighted that. We're going to take some time for question and answer. And what we can do here is I'd love to have some folks just drop some questions into the chat box. I think I'm looking at the chat box. So you can do that while those are flowing in. We've actually got a few questions that Larry collected in advance and sent to us. And so I'm going to run through those few questions first. One was, he asked this, he says, what's your take on the issue of endogeneity and how it's being handled by authors overall? And what are some misconceptions and mistakes and tips on how to correct them? Aaron, you've done a lot of work on endogeneity. In fact, I remember attending a PDW that you did on that topic not too long ago. So I'm going to turn that over to you. Can you answer that question for us?
Yeah, so my own, well, outside of the fact that I guess I'm just a general nerd, my own fascination with endogeneity started out of frustration through the review process, because you'd send something in and there's just a lot of confusion on reviewers, even on some editors. It advanced through the field rather quickly in some ways. So you'd think you were addressing the problem that they asked for, and really they meant something entirely different. So some of this is terminological. And I think something Jim said is being really specific about the source of endogeneity will be really helpful. There's a number of papers that outline different terminologies and sources. And so, omitted variables is one form of endogeneity. Selection bias is one form of endogeneity. Rebecca mentioned reverse causality. That's a form of endogeneity. So being very specific that, hey, I'm addressing this problem can be really helpful in clarifying for the reviewers that, oh, okay, they're addressing the fundamental concerns. That said, part of the problem is also when you're a reviewer, don't kick the can down the road in reverse. Don't do what you don't want as an author, which is you have endogeneity, deal with it. That's really not helpful. And if you've gotten that comment as an author, it's really not fair. Hopefully the editor will weigh in, or will at least say, hey, you should think through this and offer some insights. But when you're reviewing, be cognizant in return and say, hey, my concern of endogeneity is this specific form. And here's why I think it's a concern. So I think just being more open and transparent across the spectrum. I know sometimes the review process may feel like, a fight, and it's not. Like Brian said, the editors are there to help you. It's an open conversation. Be open that, you can't address all forms of endogeneity in one set of analyses potentially, but you can get a lot better than not doing any, or you can do better than being confused about the approach. So, just slow down and take it step by step. Hey, do I have this form of endogeneity? Do I have this form? Do I have that form? If I did, what would it look like? So hopefully that can help.
Well stated, Aaron. Thank you. Super important topic. Larry also asked this. He said, much of the entrepreneurship and strategy empirical research uses secondary data and databases. What are some of the methodological issues you see in this line of work, and any suggestions for scholars to consider in designing studies that use secondary data and databases? Jim, that pertains mostly to entrepreneurship and strategy research. You do both, so maybe you could answer that question.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of already talked about some of the problems, but maybe didn't talk too much sort of about the solutions. I mean, the first one that sort of comes to my mind is, the data are, especially when you're using an archival data set, the data are somewhat fixed, right? You can't really go back. You can't make them different than they are. So you really, the thing you still can change is your theoretical story, which sometimes means, it might mean just, if you want to tell one story, but the data don't match, you may have to just tell a completely different story. I mean, go into the data and see what the measures actually align with, and then go back to find a theoretical question that you can address. I mean, Aaron just used the example of sports, right? I agree with him completely. It's not a coach is maybe not a good thing for looking at a CEO. But what if you're looking at teams that work together over a long period of time? And I think there's been some studies where they've looked at basketball players and how they have some sort of tacit understanding of where the other player is going to be. Well, that kind of works, right? If you're understanding tacit, so find a theoretical question that works with the data that you have. The other thing is, a lot of times you look for more data. I mean, there are industry-specific data sets. There are all these creative data sets that are out there. I see them sometimes. I'm like, whoa, that's really cool. I didn't know that that was there. Another solution is multiple methods. I think that's just the way the field is going. If you can use either qualitative data or an experiment or a survey combined to get at the mechanism that's behind whatever you're looking at. And then, as Aaron was just talking about, there are usually the problems with archival data have to do with the measures not quite lining up with what you want. You have just sort of, you have items that are reflective of the construct, but they're not really measures of the construct. And so you end up having to rule out all these alternative explanations. It took me a long time when I first, the word endogeneity comes from economics, right? It's the economists trying to confuse our world. It's just an alternative explanation, right? It's a missing variable, it's reverse causality, or I forget what or selection bias. I mean, it's just, we have always addressed those things. We just use different language until the economists kind of came in and decided to make it convoluted. So, deal with, once you name what the thing is, go in and find out what the tools are for dealing with that specific thing. If it's an omitted variable, figure out what it is that's missing, and then try to find the right tool for addressing that missing variable problem. Is there some other thing that we can predict that if we could predict it and pull that prediction out, then maybe that would justify what we're doing. So it does take a lot. I mean, this is why you see all these fancy manipulations in these archival papers. It's because you're dealing with the problems of the archival data that is just sort of not there. The last thing I would sort of say is, and I see this a lot, where a paper will go, here's this relationship we don't understand very well between, say, A and B. So we're going to study it, and then just to dive deeper, we're going to look at a bunch of moderators, right? And we're going to look at C, D, J, and L, right? And they're just, they almost come across as like, these are the ones that worked when we ran the data we had, right? I ran 20 variables and these 5 work, so these are my hypotheses. And I think this, I always push authors to have what I call a theoretical frame, which is, if that main effect is interesting, then the moderators should all be around the same story. In other words, if my theory is that legitimacy is driving it and that, that the relationship between A and B should be stronger, if my theory is right, then what are the conditions under which my theory would be more right? And what are the conditions under which my theory would be less right, right? And then those moderators have to come out of that story. They have to be part of the same frame. If they don't fit in the same theory, they don't belong, right? And so that helps a lot with, because in some ways with an archival data set, that by doing that, you're able to sort of, any of the problems that were in that main effect, if you can also show that all the moderators also flow with the argument, you're actually strengthening your main effect arguments at the same time through the moderators that you add. That's my 2 cents on that.
Boy, that's such a simple concept, and yet so profound. What's the moderator that when this is present is going to make my theory stronger? Yeah, that's that we should choose. And I love the endogeneity. It's omitted variables. It's reverse causality. It's selection bias. At the end of the day, you're talking about the boom, boom, but let's not make it something it isn't. Right? I love that. Very, very practical. I have another question here from Larry, which I think, Rebecca, you'll be well suited to this. Can you talk about data overlap? How much do you see articles at JOM that have data overlap, and what are your recommendations for what constitutes sufficient data and design for a new article? Can you talk about both data overlap and the design issues for a new article, Rebecca?
Yeah, sure. So Brian actually told me that of the submissions that come in, 10 to 20% around there have data overlap. Mm-hmm. So the best case scenario, you have a entirely unique data set. It has not been used previously for publication, and you only plan to use it for this one specific study. But data, organizational behavior data anyway, is, I'm sure strategies is as well, but it's extremely expensive, especially high quality data, or at least that's what I'm finding. I've had data collections that have gone up to $9,000, so that's really, really expensive. In light of that, I bring up the cost because I think that's why a lot of us OB scholars will try to use the data for multiple purposes. I would say that it's sufficient to use a data set a second time if it's a situation where the core story of 2 different theoretical models, they don't really overlap at all. So I like to provide examples. So let's take the model where it's ethical leadership to trust to organizational citizenship behavior. Maybe you collect one big data set that tests that, and then you have an entirely separate non-leadership model that looks at something different, something like parental identity threat to shame to withdrawal from the organization. In my view, that would be sufficient. None of the variables even overlap. So that would be the second criteria, I would say. Best case, no data overlap. Second situation would be you have this paper published in Journal of Management. You're going to Journal of Applied Psychology now, but none of the variables overlap, even though it was part of this larger data collection. The third scenario is where I pay more attention. This would be a situation where the data, there is one overlapping variable. So maybe this is a situation where let's just take the examples that I just provided. Let's go to the model where I said parental identity threat leads to shame, which then leads to organizational withdrawal. If you took ethical leadership and used that as a first stage moderator, this would be a situation where even though ethical leadership was used as an antecedent variable in a different theoretical model that's published, I would say that with it being used as a moderator, a sufficiently different way, so it's not being used as an IV again, instead it's being used as a moderator in an entirely different theoretical model using an entirely different theory, that might be a situation where it's okay. So when I talk to my doctoral students about this, I usually say, try not to reuse variables, but if you do, if it's positioned entirely differently, like as a moderator or an outcome as opposed to an antecedent variable, and the theory is very different, this could be a situation where it's okay to have an overlapping variable across two studies. I don't think it's really great as a rule of thumb to have a model where it's ethical leadership to trust to OCB, and then you try to go to a different journal and you have transformational leadership to trust to OCB. That's too similar. I think you're slicing things too thin in that situation. My personal opinion is that when a data set's been used 3 times, you're kind of hitting the limit. It's probably exhausted those data at that point. But it also depends on how big the data set is, how many variables are in the data set. So there's a lot of like other things to consider. Experimental data should not be reused, in my opinion, because you have this manipulated effect that's driving something. And so let's say you're manipulating ethical leadership to trust, and then you also include as a different mediator something like moral emotions. Why not just create a much bigger model where your ethical leadership manipulation is leading to these 2 different mediators, in which case it's a much more robust test of what you're going at, instead of trying to like parse out 2 separate papers. I think that gets a little bit dicey. So I don't know if I'm providing clear enough advice, but hopefully some of what I'm saying will resonate with you and help you make decisions.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. That is awesome. We've got one last prepared question here from Larry that he collected before we started. And he asked this, he said, for scholars seeking to explore emerging societal issues such as income inequality, racism, social justice, climate change, what advice do you have for them when it comes to robust design and methodology? First of all, I think this is really important research. And so I love the question because we want this research at JOM. In fact, we have an editorial commentary coming out on this topic that I think you'll find super interesting with a battery of researchers on this that it came out of a workshop, and then they collected their thoughts. It's super interesting. But I had a few thoughts that I wanted to toss out. One is kind of a new thought that I'm kind of putting out here for discussion. And that is, what about requesting reviewers that are specific to what you're doing research on? And you know what made me think about this is that I do work on representation, and we talk in the theory of representation, we talk about substantive representation and descriptive representation. So substantive representation, imagine that you've got a representative, maybe you're African-American, and you've got a representative that is really concerned about issues pertaining to the African-American community. That person is affording you substantive representation, say politically or on a board or something like that. But maybe they're not Black. All right. And so now, what if you have, an actual Black African-American representative? So they may or may not be providing the substantive representation you want, but they afford you descriptive representation. I talk about that theory because I think it applies here. And what I've never heard anyone say, and I've never heard anyone do, is to request descriptive representation in their reviewers or their editors. And I think that's worthy of conversation. And frankly, I think there's times when it could be okay. You're doing research on, for example, I've got a paper right now I'm handling on exploitation of sex workers in India. And I think it would be fair for the authors to say, we'd like one of the reviewers to be female because we feel like they could offer a unique perspective. So maybe there's other issues of diversity, like a race issue, and you might request someone of a particular race to review your paper. I don't know, I've never talked about this with anybody. This is the first time I'm saying it out loud, but I feel like that's a discussion worth having. And I've never seen it happen. I've never seen anybody do that. And I've never talked to anyone about that, but I think it's something worth thinking about, especially for some of the topics that were mentioned in the question. Another thing that I think is really helpful with this kind of research is to interpret the impact, because sometimes you're working on a topic that's so meaningful that it can, if you look at all the levers you have to pull to get a paper published, right? If you've got a topic that's so meaningful, sometimes it can overcome other areas. Oh, you know what? We had a really small sample size, right? But, if you've got a meaningful output or topic, that can help you with that. And I think it's important with this research too, to study organizations and the people in them, because, while we want this kind of research, we don't want research that's pure psychology. We don't want research that's pure sociology or geology. It needs to be an organization. So it's got to have something. We're still the Journal of Management, and so we've got to bring it back to management. We have 5 minutes, and so there's a couple of questions here in the chat box that I'm going to turn to. Let's see. The first one was, can you discuss? And I'm going to turn this to you, Rebecca. Rebecca, you're an editor for us now, and you were in the prior team as well. Someone's asked, can you talk a bit about how decisions are made for papers that get to the R&R process? So, when you've evaluated papers that are in the R&R process, what's important to you at that juncture?
So Brian, you actually you started to suggest some of this in your initial opening comments, so I'm going to reiterate them because I think this is so important. At the R&R stage, those R&Rs that aren't so successful, they don't have a conversation with me. So in other words, the reviewers set up their response letter and they just provide really basic, really short responses. Now, short isn't necessarily bad because sometimes a response letter can be way too long too. So you have to really find that fine balance between expressing yourself concisely, getting your point across, but making sure your point is getting across to where the review team understands your thinking. So many of the decision letters will just be bare bones, and then I don't understand why this decision was made or that one, or why is it that they don't seem to be following my advice, or they seem to have understand part of my advice, but maybe not all of it. So are they misinterpreting? So like in my own work, sometimes I'll say like, I think if I don't understand what the editor is saying, because I don't reach out to my own editors who very often, I don't know, I guess I see them as being really busy, I'm not sure. But so I'll often say like, Brian, or editor, this is what I think you were saying, and then respond. So that way there's like this mutual understanding, hopefully, of what's going on. The other times is where the other important thing is I think the response letter is important, but then also following most of the advice, but then if you can't or you don't want to follow all of the advice, explaining thoroughly why you're not going along with the advice, because as Brian said, we're so busy. So sometimes, and we don't know your papers intimately. And so maybe we missed something, or maybe we misunderstood something. So just because the editor or reviewers are saying to do X, Y, and Z, sometimes their advice isn't the best because they didn't understand what you initially did, and what you initially did was actually good enough. You just need to explain. So I think it's this fine balance between trying to incorporate a lot of what they recommended, but if you think they're wrong, I think that's okay too, as long as you fully explain things. I don't want to keep going. I feel like I could keep going a lot on this one, but hopefully that's some of what you can take hopefully that helps you a little bit.
Good, that's good. And I think
I'd like to add just one really quick thing to that, because I agree with Rebecca about that. It is a conversation very much at that point. But I also get a lot of letters where it's like they're trying to converse with me, but they don't actually tell me in the response letter what they did in the paper in response to the. I mean, that's ultimately what I want to see is here was the comment. What did you do to respond to it? I mean, it can be done. It needs to be done in a conversational tone, but you can't just like discuss all the theories around this and then forget to say what you did or didn't do.
Yeah, and this is, I think, really particularly important in the methods section, because I think, as I think about times when I've staked my flag and said, no, you've asked me to do something, and I'm going to disagree here, it's more often than not a methods issue. There's a few more questions. I'm just going to mention a couple of them quickly we're running out of time. We have 2 minutes left. So it's going to be like a lightning round here. I'm going to provide a few answers in the lightning round. What are your suggestions for authors as to whether to save some robustness checks for after the first review? Simple. Don't do it.
Done.
Go for it. Yeah, in the first submission, just go. Give us your best. Put your best foot forward right away. Don't save stuff for the review process. What's your take on multiple studies, but using a different measure for the same construct across these? Again, very simple answer. Woo-hoo, yes, we love that. And those are the best papers. So, for example, a field survey and an experiment, because using the same measure is not possible. Exactly. Those are really strong papers. Alexander says the methods papers per se are a rare pleasure at JOM. It's about 1 to 2 papers a year. Can you advise the editorial team on writing the methods papers that will allow to develop and fit the paper to JOM? Yeah, certainly we want methods papers. We don't get a lot. And so our acceptance rate for methods papers is probably a little bit better than our acceptance rate for regular papers. That's just because we don't see a ton of methods papers, but we certainly do. Aaron referred to one recently by John Busenbart. And so I think what you're going to see from our team, which took over a year ago, is a little bit higher than 1 or 2 a year. That's probably going to be more like a half a dozen a year. Here's a question from iPhone. Are journals open to interdisciplinary topics like strategy and OB? Where should that be submitted? Certainly, yeah, we love that. I think there's increasingly, there's a whole category now that we call meso, and there's an increasing number of papers where I don't know who to send it to. And so we have a senior editor for OB, that's Chad Van Eydeking, a senior for strategy, that's Zeki Simsek, and a senior editor for methods, and that's Chris Byron. And there's many times I'll email all three and I'll just be like, I'm not really sure who should get this paper. What do you guys think? And do you have an associate editor that can handle it? Because it crosses over. Miranda, Aaron answered Miranda's question. Let's see. And I think we'll get one more question here. Can I ask a question about sample selection in strategy in terms of companies in the time period? I see scholars use the S&P 500, the Fortune 500, or some other firms, but some of them didn't really explain why they use that, as well as the time period. What are the criteria we select for the sample? So this is a super interesting question. I actually got a paper recently where they did not state their time period. I won't send that under review. If it's somebody that does an experiment, I might not ask them, but they just download it from CompuStat, and I sent it back to I didn't reject it either. I sent it back to the authors and I said, you didn't say the time period, and the reviewers are going to go bananas. And they fixed it, and then they resubmitted, and then we sent the paper out for review. And a lot of times we'll use S&P 500 or S&P 1500 because they're so doggone big and publicly traded, and data is available for them. But if you can go beyond that, you've already added value to the literature by virtue of the fact that everybody else is using the same databases. But if you can confirm relationships outside of those, 1,500 companies or a couple thousand companies, that can go a long way for you. Well, we almost a minute or two over. We're so thankful for Lisa for arranging, Jim, Rebecca, and Aaron for being here with us. And Mary Ellen, I know you're recording, so I'm going to let you turn this off. And thank you, everyone, for joining us here live today. Goodbye.